I was trying to get the diet first.
Okay, everybody look for a seat. Yeah. Everyone that's watching us at home, there are 200 people here, all seated in the back row. They're very cozy. Okay, 7 o'clock, and we'll now begin. Could we have roll call, please?
Councilmember Costa?
Present.
Councilmember Starbuck?
Present.
Councilmember Lingle?
Here.
Mayor Pro Tem Dwayne Holmdahl?
Here.
Mayor John Lynn?
Here. And if you'd all rise for the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge
Allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Okay, and now for oral communications, your chance to talk to us for 5 minutes about pretty much anything.
Hello, my name is Charles Summer, citizen and business manager of Lompoc Civic Theater, and I've come to promote our current production of Clutter, the true story of the Collier brothers who never threw anything out. I have information for each member on the dais. Let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4. I don't have any tickets for sale. I apologize for not bringing that. I'm sure everyone in attendance would have wanted to purchase one, other than Dean, who came and saw the show on Saturday. So if you want a review, you can talk to him, or on Friday in the Lompoc Record, there will be a review written by Brad Mamberto, and it's a very touching show. It took a lot of work. It's one of our longer shows we've done in recent years. But I would have to say personally, this being my third show with Lompoc Civic Theater, it's one of the better ones. It's a great show. And if anybody wants a card, I have about 7 more, and I would love to invite everyone on the dais, everyone in attendance, and then everyone at home to come and see the show. It runs for the next 2 weekends. Friday, Saturday at 7:30, and Sunday matinee at 2. So I thank you for your time, and go ahead and raise your hand if you would like some information. They're going up so fast, but thanks again, and have fun with your meeting.
The chief raised his hand. He wants one.
Of course he does.
Okay, anyone else for oral communications? Going once, going twice, gone. Okay. So our first item this evening is acceptance of the annual financial statements for the year ending June 30th, 2013. And it's Brad, who is also our computer technician, and he will be filling in as our city attorney tonight also.
You don't want that.
In the interest of saving some money, we didn't ask the city attorney to come. This is not a regular meeting. So no hard questions.
Okay. Thank you, Mayor. Council members. This first item, we've invited one of the partners from Glenn Burdett to be here in case there's any questions from the auditor side. Alan Eisenbach is here. He's been the partner on this engagement since we started with him in 2011. Patrick Wymiller and I met with him in January to go over the audit findings, audit recommendations. In the report, we have a brief discussion on the items that are either in the audit as findings in the audit, or findings that are in the management letter, which have been provided to you. A lot of that, well, some of them are technical in nature that we've already taken steps to correct. There are 3 that are related to fixed assets that really kind of go back to the way that we manage our financial system. As you may well know, our financial system is from the early 80s, and it's been in place for many, many years. It's been very robust and able to take care of things, but as new mandates come in from the outside world for GASB 34, for various other things for Affordability Care Act. There are some parts of our system that are just having a harder time keeping up, and which is one of the reasons why in this year's budget we talked about having starting to look at changing out our finance system, and one of those components would be our fixed asset system, payroll, utility billing, which would help push us into the next phase of providing services to our community and to our customers. Other than that, I just wanted to make some small points here. Since we have had Glenn Burdett, we've been able to utilize them to kind of look at our whole entire financial operations to get a look at processes that we've been doing for 20, 30 years, and look at them from a fresh perspective. And there was a lot of things that they were able to assist us with in bringing some of our processes and procedures up to date. And one thing that I'm very proud of this year with our management team is this is the first year that we've been able to issue our financial statements within 6 months of the end of the fiscal year. We've been able to do that with our OMB single audit report for the last 4 or 5 years, but we did have a few years where we were late. This year we were, they're issued before the end of December, which is great. Next year we're looking to either next year or the year after, we're looking to return to providing a CAFR, which is a higher level of reporting from what's being provided this year, which is our annual financial statements. Having said that, one of the recommendations that's in this staff report actually kind of dovetails with the discussion that's in the next couple of presentations. And having a strong financial statement, both financially and report-wise, provides us flexibility in the future. That flexibility would allow us to take advantages of cost-saving measures, such as refinancing some of our bond debt. We won't be able to do that until our utilities that have bond debt are healthier, but we also need to have a good, solid track record with our issuing our financial statements. So the two really go hand in hand, having healthy financials and also having financial statements that are issued timely and in good standing. Having said that, I'm going to stop at this point in time. If there's any specific questions that council has, and I'll give Al a chance to make any comments that he has or answer questions you may have from the audit perspective.
Councilmember Lingle.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Brad, in the letter from Glenn Burdett, under the subtitle Full Recovery of Net Positions, the last sentence in the first paragraph, it says, the broadband fund has continued to have operating loss and has a deficit position. And then it says, in the next paragraph, it says, we recommend for management to consider if it would be better to reflect public policy to include the activity of the broadband fund as part of the government activities. What does that mean? What would we do there? It's the very last, that is the very last sentence in the cover letter from Glenn Burdett. So it says, we recommend. And I'm just not sure what process.
Well, that goes back to, there are two major categories of reporting for city financial statements. We have the general fund, which is governmental, and we have some others that are governmental in nature as well. But we also have several business type activities that are accounted for as if they were standalone entities. When the broadband utility was set up as a utility, it was set up as an enterprise fund. It has morphed and evolved over time to be more, there's still a lot of customers that are using it from the external world, but we've also morphed it to be able to be much more of an internal service fund for the city. And that internal service fund is effectively more of a governmental type activity than it is a true enterprise utility fund. The recommendation that Glenn Burdett has in there was based on a discussion that we had that because we're using it mostly for bringing back our utility reads, we're going to be using it for our infrastructure that's being taken away from us by Comcast in January of 15. Those types of activities that we are using for governmental use really make it more of a governmental type activity. In reality, it wouldn't really have much to change because we would still have customers that are paying us their amount on their utility bill. We would still have internal customers that are using it for phones, utility services, that kind of stuff. It was just really the representation of what that is on our financial statements. What we did in the budget this year is because it has borrowed money from the electric fund to first be initiated and then to develop, is once the outside financing is paid off at the end of this calendar year, and because it's taken on more responsibility for providing services that Comcast used to provide to us for free, it's going to have positive cash flow that we can use to start paying back that loan to electric fund, which is a separate discussion from what is in the management letter. But in the management letter and in the discussions I had with the audit manager, we will likely turn that utility, right now it's a utility enterprise fund, and likely turn it into an internal service fund, much like our fleet services is an internal service fund, providing services to all the other divisions of the city.
So it's just a shifting from one fund to another?
It will probably stay in the same exact fund it's in, but it's a shifting of how we report on our financial statements.
Okay, so when it says we recommend the management, is this something that you'll be asking the council to recommend, or is this something that...
We may ask you to affirm that we now have an internal service fund rather than having a enterprise fund, but the nature of the fund is really internal services, so regardless of whether there's an explicit authorization to turn it into an internal service fund, it's for financial purposes and for transaction purposes, it is an internal service fund. So for reporting purposes, we will show it as what the characteristics of it is already. And we did the same thing when GASB 54 came out, which is the fund balance policy. We looked at a lot of our existing special revenue funds that, based on the criteria of GASB 54, are really just part and parcel of the general fund. So in this document, you actually have activities for the general fund, but from our fund structure, it actually includes 10 or 12 different funds that we have in our books. We retain those funds separately because we want to track them separately, and we'll continue to track this one separately as well.
Okay, thank you.
Councilmember Starbuck.
Real quick, Brad, just for my own knowledge here, on page 2 under the reserve accounts, it talks about the wastewater reserve required in the village, Vandenberg Village Community Service District there.
Mm-hmm.
Do we have a reserve fund that we hold in balance for the Air Force Base, or they just billed monthly? What's the difference between our outlying customers here?
Well, we have a contract with both, and both contracts specify that they keep with us a working capital reserve fund. There is differences because the Air Force Base is a federal governmental entity that has different rules. So Vandenberg Village pays us every year based on their share of the capital outlays that we make every year. And they also keep in our cash pool a working capital reserve that is based on their capital capacity rights to the plant. The Air Force Base is a little bit different because their capital structure funding mechanism is entirely different than their structure for operational purposes. So operations tries to pay us a small amount out of their operations fund, which is $60,000 a year for capital purposes. So they do have a working capital reserve, but the mechanism for how we capture that between the two entities is a little bit different.
Brad, with regard to the software that you're looking at, would that help you generate the accounting statements more quickly going forward, which is your objective?
Several of the new systems that are out there that are available that are basically packaged accounting softwares have mechanisms for both the state controller reporting and financial reporting. So there's likely efficiencies that can be gained by having that system. Right now we're using extracts from the system, download it into Excel, and we manage that way. So there's several that are out there that do it. How they do it varies widely between the various accounting systems.
And I think you actually, on the ones you were looking at, as we talked about it some time ago, you're able to get some on-the-fly reports in more real time, if you will, as you go through the year.
Well, as we go through tonight's presentations, and hopefully it will be very quickly, but you'll realize that we actually have a very talented staff in finance. And when Dean came along from the federal prison system as the accounting person, he has been able to codify and create programs within Excel that far exceed anything we've been able to do in the past, and that expertise is invaluable, and that will be able to help us both transition from our existing system to whatever financial system we go to once we do a transition, and get a lot of those on-the-fly reports going forward. Having said that, a lot of the newer systems have almost all the standard reports that a California utility or a California municipal agency would probably need anyway. So.
And the one thing with regard to the Wi-Fi, is it the percentage that would drive it from one side of the ledger to the other? So if 51% were intergovernmental as opposed to 51% being
That's part of
access?
what's in the GASB criteria, is how much of the service is being provided to internal customers versus how much is being provided to external customers. It's not a flat 50%, but that's one of the criteria you look at to say this is really an internal service. We theoretically could have our fleet service and have it provide to customers some retail use. But we don't do that because we don't want to compete with the outside world. But for broadband, because we already have an external use, there's no reason why we can't keep that, but still have it showing up as a governmental type activity in the financial statements. What it does wouldn't change. It's just how we report it.
Well, I think next year we might see a fairly substantial influx of customers on the broadband side with the Reading Plus initiative between the United Way and the school district, because they're looking for connectivity through the city.
Yeah.
So that might be something to look at before the final decision is made.
Yeah.
Okay. Oh, sorry.
Just one thing brought up early on in your comment, saying that most of our system goes back to the 80s. Well, what we're talking about today is 30 years down the road. And what has happened in those systems, it's all grown, and it's fantastic that we're now looking at the new systems, bringing it aboard. Even though once we get it in, there's going to be new stuff anyway. But we're looking at 30 years of changes going into this coming year.
And we were able to manage that very well for most of that 30 years, because one advantage of having a system that's internal, we had 3 very talented programmers that we had for several years, and they knew our system. They actually created some of the systems from scratch on our platform, and they knew how to do that back and forth. We have all of them have retired. We have programmers that have replaced them, but they don't have that 30 years of experience on our system. And if we wanted to keep it for another 30 years, I'm sure they would get that experience, but we want to have something that can provide services internally to our staff, but also externally. The type of services that we can provide in utility billing from a new system compared to what we have right now is night and day. So we want to be able to switch to a new system so we can provide those added services to our customers without adding to our cost of providing those services. So.
Councilmember Costa?
Thank you, Marilyn. I do think that is somewhat a question of identity for our broadband. I mean, really, is it primarily an internal service with sort of an ancillary external use, or do we want to market it stronger to external customers and try to bring in additional revenues that way? I think we need to have that conversation on the council level. I do have a question about the control deficiencies that were identified, and I believe Mr. Burdett, that's who's here this evening? No.
Glenn Burdett is the firm. Alan Eisenbach is.
Sorry. Somebody signed Glenn Burdett, so I thought it was a person. I think you'll go into this further, but I believe we were aware of some of these issues that were identified in that letter, were we not? Or was all of this relatively new information for us? Or maybe that's a good segue.
If we may, in all of these things, I prefer to have the auditor respond, particularly to their overview and their opinion letter. So this would be a good segue, I think, for Alan to address it. Thanks.
So your question was really about the findings specifically? And
Yeah.
whether they were previously aware of them?
Right. If you were under the impression that this is something that staff was aware of, or was this relatively new information that we're coming across some of these control deficiencies that you identified in that letter?
Well, the two control findings specifically related to the fixed asset system, I think there was definitely some awareness. One of them was a carryover finding from the prior year. And there were two different areas, I think 13.1 and 13.2, two separate findings that kind of overlap together related to the fixed asset system, and really reconciling them and really updating it. And I think that was in part what Brad was referring to, some of the things that Dean can do in Excel, get things caught up, and just some of the system limitations we've had. We had a very good discussion with Patrick and Brad and their staff in our exit meeting about all of these findings, about the system that's 30 years old, about the process involved in evaluating and potentially implementing a new system, some of the challenges that go in with that. And it was I think a broad-ranging discussion beyond just the specific control findings that have been the struggle with kind of with the old system. But that doesn't change the fact that, yes, there were some differences, and I think they've been addressed. But there were definitely some system limitations that contributed to that.
And the other question I have is, not having a ton of experience with this, so if you can give me some context, and I'm sure it's different in every case, was the case for Lompoc's findings relatively mundane, or were they out of the ordinary in any way?
No, I don't think there was anything out of the ordinary. This is really our third year, and each year I think things have improved, and the things that we have found have been of a less significant degree, if you will. The timing, or timeliness of getting through the process is very indicative, I think, of I would refer to it as the tightening up of everything, and I think that was the goal when we started, was for things to continue to kind of develop and for the bar to be raised, and the staff's done a great job with that. And so, as Brad said, we're looking at trying to implement reporting under the comprehensive annual financial report, which I think the city has previously had, but it's been quite some time. And so that can't be done unless things are happening timely and things have improved and tightened up, and we've definitely seen that. And so, I don't think there's anything about the current year findings that should be of a significant concern. But I think it's also, their desire has always been to bring the issues forward, identify things, and identify ways that they can continue to tighten the process internally.
Thank you.
I'd actually like to follow up on that real quick.
Sure.
And everything Alan said was exactly right. One of the reasons why I was very happy to have an opportunity to switch auditors was the fact that we had an auditor for some time before I got here, and this provided an opportunity for me to kind of get a clean slate. If there's anything that was a problem or something that needed to change, having Glenn Burdett come in and look at everything from a fresh perspective helped both the city, and it also helped me to find where things might not have been done in the most current way. And that it was able to help us find a lot of things. That there is one activity in the way that we reported the water retrofit program that had been done since 1989. And it was something that they showed us that we were doing it wrong for that amount of time. So we were able to fix that. It had nothing to do with how the disbursements were made. It was how we reported the remaining balance on the financial statements. But they did show us that this is the way we're supposed to be doing it now, and it gave us the ability to make that switch on our day-to-day operations. So it was a very timely switch because it was about a year after I took over as management services. So,
City Administrator.
I just wanted to expand just ever so slightly on this aspect. We certainly had some systems, that we would tighten up as we'd go along. And I think anytime we switch an audit firm, a new audit firm comes in with a new perspective, and so we try to align with those suggestions and recommendations. All that aside, the issue that we were discussing about the 30-some-year-old accounting system is really key to understand, because it's more than just having aged software. We are, in that 30 years' time, there's been quite a bit of advancements and changes in GASB reporting rules and the like. And if you've got older software, not only is it taking you longer to manipulate, if you will, or to translate, I guess is a better word, translate the data from how it's presented in an older system to how you have to present it with newer requirements. It also then, ultimately you may have some system limitations, and that's why it's so important to, proceed forward with updating the accounting system. But I do believe, to answer the question you had earlier, Mayor, I do believe it'll be a great platform for able to have timely reporting going forward, to be able to upgrade to a CAFR level of financial statement at the end, which ultimately I would hope would give you an even higher level of comfort in your role as a fiduciary oversight on the processes. So I just wanted to put that in, because sometimes we talk about newer software just because it sounds like, we're in this technology age and we want to update it, but it has some very practical applications here that'll help us quite a bit. Thank you.
I think maybe I can put it in perspective for the public. So a question from the auditor. Is there anyone else left on earth that gives you printouts on wide format, green band, impact printer paper besides us?
There's a couple out there. I mean, there's some older systems that.
So there is someone that has something older than we have.
I answered the question about the reports. I don't know the age of the different systems, but.
One of the heartbreaks in my life is once upon a time in my liquidation world, I had 2 pallets of that paper, and I didn't know the city used it, and we couldn't find anybody that wanted it, and we literally recycled it. So you guys could have had a lifetime supply.
There you go.
Yep. Okay.
I just have one thing to add on to what Patrick said, is that you'll hear later that we've, Melinda, Dean, and I went to the CSMFO conference this year and learned a lot of things at that conference about reserve policies. We went there specifically to talk to various vendors about the finance systems, and one thing we came away from that is that entities that try to do a really quick conversion usually fail. And they said that the vast majority of customers that do it in a methodical, thought-out pattern, it takes 2 to 3 years for that whole process to take place. So it's not going to be something that we just flip a switch on July 1st and have a new system. It's going to take a well-thought-out, task-based method, and then implementing those various modules on a very thought-out basis going forward. So I think that's one of the reasons why we, in the past, have not really considered doing it, because it is a very labor-intensive, time-intensive, and to some extent cost-intensive thing to do. But we do realize a lot of efficiencies, a lot of benefits to our customers, a lot of benefits that outweigh that detrimental time value of doing the actual transition. So
Perhaps you could speak to, I know you visited with another government entity that followed that rather methodical process. Maybe you could speak to their experience.
Well, actually, I can speak as a former auditor about the other way. I've gone into audits of other municipalities in my prior life as a CPA, and those entities had to unwind so many things because they went into a transition to a new system. 8 or 10 months later, they go back to the old system because they just didn't do it right. That would be my fear, is that we would go down this road to a new system and it failed because we didn't have enough planning done, and we'd have to go back to our existing system just to be able to issue financial statements. So the planning of it is very important, and implementation of it over a controlled time frame is also very important.
Who was the city that you talked to when you mentioned you'd been to see one that had done a changeover?
Well, there's one or two on the Central Coast that are going through it right now, and one of our fellow cities in our valley is going through a change right now, further east.
Are there any other questions? Councilmember Costa.
Thank you, Marilyn. I think that's a very thoughtful approach to that transition. I appreciate you saying that because I probably would have assumed differently had you not said that. But understanding that it is somewhat labor intensive and cost intensive, does some of that cost get transferred to assistance with the transition or only for the software itself? My primary question being, can we endure this transition with current staffing?
I went to a CSMFO chapter meeting and where the county of San Luis presented on how they went through their change. And they didn't necessarily have outside people doing it, because by having outside people do it, the internal people that will have to run it don't learn how to use it. But they did have an outside entity managing the process, so it wouldn't overwhelm the current staff, but it also allowed them time to have a bridge between the companies that are providing the services and the staff that have to implement it. Their situation was a little bit different because as a county there's many more systems in place, so they actually had multiple vendors. So that consultant was actually kind of corralling the multiple vendors into one conduit between the county and the vendors. So I think we would have to use our own people, only because we want those people to be able to use the system going forward. And for better or for worse, going through that transition process is probably the best way to learn how to use the system to the best ability we can.
Thank you.
May I just add to that based on my experience and observations? And that's because I agree with what Brad said. It's the core meat and potatoes work that's being done. If it can be done by your staff, they're learning the system. If it's a 2 or 3 year implementation, they're juggling their historical workload with some additional responsibilities, and it can take a toll over that period of time. And so it's kind of key to be aware of that, manage it, be communicating about workloads so that you don't burn some people out and lose some good people in the process. So there's kind of a delicate balance that has to happen.
Okay, any other questions? Okay, public comment. Anybody want to talk to us about this? Don't everybody run down here at once. Going once, going twice, gone. Back to the council. Who'd like to move the recommendation? Councilmember Holmes.
I'll be glad to move the recommendation. I think what I've heard tonight is excellent. The idea that the last thing I heard is using staff to help do it instead of bringing outside people, setting the system up, then trying to train them. I've had enough businesses that if I have that person that's going to use the job, work with somebody else, then it'll work. That transition is so much better, and they're all working together. So I like the way the whole program is going and what we heard tonight. So I move the recommendation, which would be.
Council
I'll second.
Council accept the financial statements together with the independent auditor's report for the fiscal year ending June 30th, 2013. And any further comment? No. Let's vote, please. Passes 5-0. Thank you. And now for something even more exciting, the presentation of the mid-year review and all the good news from Brad and Melinda and Dean.
While we're setting up the monitor, I just want to give you an aside about the transitions. The system we have right now, we actually obtained from Vandenberg Air Force Base or the city of Ventura, because the system we had before that crashed. So we also don't want to get to the point where our system crashes and we have to do something. So there's a balance there between having something that's working and making a transition at your speed versus having a system that you have to put in place because the other system died. So we don't want to go through that again.
You know, Brad, I'm confused. How do you crash an abacus?
Mr. Mayor, as we're setting up, if I could just, a quick comment. We've got a couple of presentations, as you know, from looking at agenda coming up. We've got this mid-year update, including a projection out in the 5 years, and then we have a discussion about reserve policies and the like. And depending on how much time we spend and how much energy we expend in the discussion for this initial part, I just point out that if, you know, it's to council's pleasure, but we've tried to divide up the presentation in such a way that if you felt we'd gotten to a point where we wouldn't be able to give fiscal policies their reserve policies their full full amount of attention, well, we don't think it's so time sensitive we wouldn't be able to bring that back to you at a different night if you prefer, but I'm sure we'll see how the evening goes. But
you know,
I know you're here for the
you
long
haven't
run.
been with us before, and we're good till about 12:30 or 1 if we have to. We get a little fuzzy after that.
Very, very well. Thank you.
I'm not going to do that. I do want to follow up on that this is really there's enough information in here for 3 different workshops. And if we, at the end result is a request to ask for the adoption of a general fund policy for reserves and the adoption of interim working capital reserves for our utilities. Because it's interim reserve policies for the utilities, if we implement them tonight or at the April 1st meeting or a meeting in May, it's not going to really change what our objectives are. But by presenting it to you now, you'll at least have some of the background of the criteria that I put into the staff report and why it makes sense to utilize the priorities that council has set to be the driver of what we want to do with our reserve policies. So having said that, this presentation is really in 3 parts. We're going to go through some background and where we are at for the city overall, and then the general fund, and I'm going to turn it over to Dean Albro, our accounting supervisor, to give you a little bit of information on our current year and current budget expectations, and then go into really the second part of the presentation, which is presenting you the first view of a tool that we've created to allow you and others to look at what our future costs are in a much longer time frame than we usually do in a 2-year budget. What we're going to be showing is that tool. The only real way to show that tool is to show what some of the scenarios are that we have in that tool. But the scenarios that we're going to be showing are just that. The scenarios could be changed. We can have different inputs. But I want to emphasize that what we're presenting is a tool, and that tool is going to be used by us for this budget cycle, the next budget cycle, and it shows what is going to happen for 2 budget cycles after that. And I just want to stress that it's a tool, and it will allow us to be proactive in what we do to try to tackle some of our challenges ahead, rather than sitting here at the first budget session saying, what do you want to do to fix this? Because we'd rather be proactive and be able to manage it going forward, rather than where we were in budget sessions for 2009, trying to figure out how we could balance a budget at that point in time. This gives you some tools and opportunities. The challenges are still there, but it provides you at least a little bit of an insight in what the things are that we have ahead of us. And I'm stressing that right now because I think the takeaway for the model is that it's a tool. So having said that, I'll just go through some of the slides. I'm going to go through pretty quickly, and some of them I might just touch on a point or two. But the information that's on here will be on the website tomorrow, and everybody in the audience here and on the podium has a copy of it. So this is just really an agenda of how we're going to do it. Dean, as our accounting supervisor, will provide some information on the general fund, and Melinda Wall, who is our financial services manager, will provide you some information on our 4 major utilities. I mentioned earlier that we attended the CSMFO conference, which is the financial managers for municipal organizations all through California. Beacon Economics, which is well known in the Central Coast for providing economic information, was there and provided a lot of forecasts that we brought back. And these are just several items that they mentioned during that presentation. 14 is better than 13. The nation as a whole is way behind on infrastructure improvements. One thing he mentioned about Central Coast is the expectation that we'll grow San Luis Obispo, Santa Barbara County by about 30% between now and 2060. That will create a lot more opportunities for economic growth. While we're in an economic upswing right now, all other things being equal, on average we're going to see another recession, whether it happens now or 10 years from now. The averages point to 2016-17 as when that recession would be. Hopefully we'll miss that, and with all the economic development we've done around here, we might be able to weather the storm hopefully a lot better than what happened in 7, 8, 9. Another presentation that was at CSMFO was the chief actuary from CalPERS. CalPERS is going to be causing a lot of those challenges that you'll see later in the model. Those challenges are either imposed by PEPRA or just because they're looking at mortality improvements or looking at ways to take care of unfunded liabilities from the perspective of CalPERS as a whole. One of the significant changes they're doing is many of the agencies are in pools, and because of PEPRA, all the pools out there right now are closed. So everything else being equal, the pools that are closed will see increasing rates going forward. You have a question?
I was just real curious what PEPRA stood for.
Public Employees Pension Reform Act. It's it created a tier 3 for miscellaneous employees and for safety employees, and there's no longer a smorgasbord of plans that entities can negotiate for. There's just one plan for miscellaneous and 3 plans for safety. And there's many other points. There are about 13 different points that are addressed in that. But for our purposes, all our new employees are coming in either at our tier 2 or tier 3, depending on whether they had previous governmental experience or not.
And their previous experience had to be within the prior 6 months?
Yeah, correct.
With another CalPERS agency?
Yeah, and there's criteria that several other things about that too. So this slide gives you a little bit of update of what has happened during the 13-14 fiscal cycle. Furloughs were eliminated for all the employees, whether they're furloughs or furlough-like. There was a 1% salary increase attached to most of the bargaining groups during that time frame. Effective August or November or December of 2013, every single employee group, every single employee is now paying their own share of CalPERS retirement costs. In the past, some amount of that for some bargaining groups were being paid by the city. I mentioned Tier 2 and Tier 3 for retirement. Both of those were implemented either in around 2011. PEPA was implemented in January 1st, 2013. We now have about 16% of our whole entire full-time workforce in Tier 2 and Tier 3. We're expecting another 45% to go into those two tiers between now and 2021, mainly by turnover, employees retiring, and new hires coming on board. And just for a little bit of perspective, between 2006 and 2013, the overall nationwide cost of living has changed by about 14%. This slide and next slide show the relative increases for our share of pension contributions. We knew that these were going up in 2013. What we know now, based on some more information that came out in mid-February that was announced by CalPERS on February 15th or 17th, the change, the blue line and the purple line are the expectations for the city's miscellaneous group, the change between 14 and what we thought was going to happen in 2013. For the miscellaneous group, the rates are still going up, but by the end of the term, they should be a little bit better than what we expected last year. The opposite is actually true with safety. The same changes have occurred with safety, and it's much closer in the beginning years, but by the outlying years, the expectation we had last year is going to be a little bit better than what it is this year. We'll have a little bit more costs. Everything else being equal, the assumption here is that CalPERS will continue getting 7.5% a year on their investment portfolio. If that changes up or down, it could be our contribution rates could be much higher or much lower. But these rates are what we have in the model based on the base assumption and regular earnings for CalPERS. This is my last slide in this section. This shows you a trend for our general fund reserves. The reserves up until 2013 include all of our general fund reserves as well as our non-general fund reserves, which are primarily the AB 702 funds that we had on hand since the early 90s. As you recall, we purposely applied those AB 702 funds to pay for getting rid of furloughs and to pay for the 1% increase in negotiated salaries. The amount of the two reserves by the end of 2015 is expected to be about 14% of our operating costs. I show this red bar, and that red bar just represents the mid-cycle appropriations of funds that we've done over the last 4 years out of reserves. For instance, for the Rape Crisis Center grant fund that stopped, we decided to use general fund reserves to pay for that. So that just represents the cumulative effect of those various increases in the use of reserves for obligations that occur in those years. So now I'm going to turn it over to Dean, who will give you a presentation on the mid-year review, which is very short because it's good news, I think, and then go into some of the modeling for the 15, 17, 17, 19, 19, 21 periods. So.
Thank you, Brad. Mayor, City Council, thank you for giving me this opportunity to talk about our budget projection system. About a year ago, Brad came to me and he said that he wanted to develop a budget projection system that could not only take our current year budget, but look at 3 budgets going forward. So tonight, since we're reporting on the mid-year, we're going to show 7.5 years going forward. And First thing we're going to do is, when we start this, we're going to start with the current budget. We looked at salary projections, vacancies, and how much we saved, when we're going to fill positions, who's getting step increases. 76% of our budget comes from salary, so it's really critical that we look at that really closely. We're also going to look at a lot of the expenses, where they are, if they're going to go forward, and we're going to look really closely at our revenues for the first 6 months, and then project how much we're going to get in a conservative nature for this year, and then look at on the whole budget. So this is our baseline. This is where we're going to start at. So as you see, we're a little over, or a little under 274,000 and 0.5%. And overall, most all the programs stayed really close to their budget, and our revenue estimates are really close. So good news to report. Wish I could just stop right now. Now I'm going to go over a little bit about what we did to do a projection going out to 2021. About 60% of the revenue that goes into the general fund comes from taxes. So I was just going to go over some of the major assumptions. There's probably about 30 revenue assumptions, and well, there's even more if you go, because there are more years, but I didn't want to go over every single one, but I kind of want to hit some of the highlights. For the last 5 years, sales tax has been around 2%, so that's what we put in the model. Property tax, housing's going up, the inventory's going down, so houses are selling for more, and they're not staying on the market as long, so we think that's going to trickle down into here. TOT, we had a pretty weak year last year, and the revenues this year were up, and we're going to project a pretty optimistic 4.7 going forward, since we have the Allen Hancock Safety Training Facility going on and the implementation of the Tourist Improvement District. So we're going to be pretty optimistic there. These numbers were just something I put in here that I thought was kind of showed a little bit about the local economy. These are the increases from what we collected last year to what we're predicting for this year. I thought that was really interesting that we got 42% increase in building permits. Hopefully that'll trickle in all our revenue sources right there. So anyways, we put all those in the model. For expenses, we pretty much just stuck what we're getting mandated with from CalPERS. And we also put what we're getting mandated for healthcare plan retirement going forward too, because they're changing their actuarial practices and expecting more. Our operating plans, we put 2.4, which is basically just the CPI average going forward. So that's what we put in our model. This is a snapshot to give you an idea of what I did. This is a snapshot of one of the dashboards. You can see right here we have our salary numbers we can put them in by year. So if we want to do, bell shapes, whatever we want to do. Same with our health insurance stuff we got here. We have our budget pool for our operations over here, and then these are all the CalPERS rates. And each one of these buttons is basically driven by code. I wrote this in Visual Basic, but the output's in Excel, so finance can, change the data and work with it, and they're familiar with it. If you were to hit one of these buttons, it's over here anyways, you're going to get an output that's going to be something like this. If you look at the blue lines, these are our revenue expectations off of the model. These two green lines are the injection of the AB 702 money, and the other two lines are our goal for our reserve balance, and this would be our actual reserve balance going forward. And I also have the net change down here. So basically with the baseline input of what we just are going to get hit with, and we know we're going to get hit with, this is our first graph. And also you can see right here we have a little drop right there, and that's mainly attributed to the COP grant. The 3 years, and then the last year we have to pay ourselves.
Dean, if you don't mind, I talked to you earlier about this, and I just want to make sure everyone realizes this program you built yourself.
Yes, yeah.
We didn't have this a year ago.
No.
So it's kind of like having a little crystal ball
Yeah.
for us to work with.
I think it's a great proactive tool. Like Brad put it, as a tool going forward. It's something I think that we can put your priorities in, or even what you think is going to happen, and you can see it on paper how it's going to pan out.
I think it's fantastic. Thanks.
Councilmember Costa?
Oh, I'm sorry.
Sorry to interrupt. Do you want me to wait?
No, go ahead.
I noticed obviously the assumptions included only statutory or regulatory obligations. Were there any other things, like inflation or anything else that we have to consider over this time frame as well?
The only inflationary is the CPI for the operations section. If you want my 2 cents, I think that with the Federal Reserve holding back, and I think it's going to probably see the lower numbers than that. But then if they suppress it too long, you could see it spike up. So it's about 24% of our budget, though. And it's kind of hard to predict, so that's why I went with the average of the over 20 years.
Okay. And besides inflation, was there any other sort of expenditure or anything else we should be aware of that wasn't included on here? Brad, it looks like Brad's.
No, it's a baseline. I'm sorry. It's pretty much a baseline. We're just putting the stuff that we know is going to happen. We know prices are going to go up. We know that CalPERS is going to change their rates. So other than that, no, it's pretty much the same budget going forward.
And I think the budget assumptions, I know Mr. Wilkie is usually fairly conservative with a lot of those assumptions, and so I think, was this in that same vein?
Yeah, I mean, it's a principle of accounting is to take if you don't know, take the conservative approach.
And that's kind of the beauty of having this as a model, is one of the assumptions was 2% for sales tax. We have a slide, a couple ones after this, that says what happens if it's 4% increases. So even though in this baseline we have some assumptions that are based on actual activity that has happened, and so it's based on historical numbers, we can model something different. And if that model for something different is supported by something that economic development is doing, then we can utilize that for the final product, which will be for the 15-17 budget.
Well, and so is the idea then to have a certain set of behaviors attached essentially to each model, so we're prepared to take that action in the case that that model ends up being the actual outcome? Is that kind of,
yeah.
Okay.
That's probably the next step, but that really goes towards setting up here's where we think we're going to be with all the percentages. We put that in the model and see where we end up with fund balance after 6 years. We'll have 2 more slides just like this, and it kind of points that out. And I'll just let you go through those next couple slides.
Sorry for the interruption.
I don't want to steal their thunder, but I think you're bringing up a great point here, and how useful the tool of the modeling is going to be. Because, for instance, we've had some fairly good news recently about our sales tax, not just how the economy is doing, but how the city itself is doing in comparison to the general economy. If we take an appropriately conservative view, we're not going to jump right out there and just assume that our entire future is going to look like that every year. But we can at least then do some more meaningful modeling about what if scenarios. As Brad mentioned, maybe we've assumed 2% because that's been more of our historical perspective. But if it becomes, if you get collectively comfortable with the idea of, for instance, 4% or something higher, then yes, then we can start, we have other things on the agenda, if you will, that we can start implementing in terms of programs of the structural changes that you all have indicated you want to see in the city. We start moving those up in the time frame a little more, I think is how it plays out. Things that we want to eventually do, maybe we can do sooner, and the sales tax is one of those areas that has a significant impact. Balancing that out is, as I mentioned, the pension obligations become on the expense side, what is the balancing characteristic of saying, well, if we can get that part taken care of, do we still have other things we can do to advance the community?
Yeah, I guess that's a great way of looking at it. I think I was looking at it in the other vein, which is that if we do have this recession coming back around in 2016-17 potentially, that there would then be a clear set of behaviors and a track to take based on these projections at that time, if that makes sense. So for both the good or if, the negative.
And I think I think it does, you can utilize it in either direction because you can start, I would hope as we build our budgets going forward, we're going to build baseline budgets and then the sort of wish list on top of the absolutely need list. And we can start as we get closer to those years and get a sense of how we're unfolding. We can make our adjustments either to the better or to the tightening based upon what we're actually experiencing. But this just helps us model those things that much stronger.
You've actually allowed us to cut about 55 minutes out of our presentation because what you're really talking about is how we want to set up our reserve policies. Having reserve policies that are flexible enough to allow for a recession and having reserves that allow us to be flexible enough to weather a recession without significantly changing our services that we're providing is really the final outcome of this. So by having reserves that are up at the upper blue line will provide the city a lot of flexibility when, not if, but whenever that next recession comes around, we'll be able to weather it much better than we would if the reserves are closer to the 14 or 10% level.
And I think their next two slides are going to give it an excellent example of the model at work, but it's important to notice what's going on here at this baseline because we're going to give an example of, well, what if we do, what if we want to continue on in what they're about to show you about after our grants expire and assuming we have the desire to keep both police and fire on that are benefited by the graph. And now I'm doing the presentation. Anyway, you can see there's a significant drop in what we see as the actual grant funding, but that's still at this assumption of 2%. If we are so bold as to say, since we experienced this past year 9.6%, while statewide they were only at 2.8%. Can we be so bold as to believe we can sustain, let's say, 4% going forward? And if we can, then keeping those officers on takes you to the next slide, and you can see more favorable results with what's happening with our reserves. So anyway, didn't mean to take away your.
You did a great job. Thank you.
It's a great tool he's made. Yeah.
Like Patrick said, on this slide here, you can see the challenges of keeping, that's 9 positions, so you would expect it to have an impact on the COP and the SAFER grants going after the grants expire. And on this one here, also like he said, this is really not, I think this is more probable than any of the assumptions going forward, but we're supposed to be, like you said, Ashley, we're supposed to be conservative. And seeing 2% above our estimate is probably, hopefully it will happen, but it shows you what a big impact it has on that reserve balance. So that is all I have. Thank you for letting me come up here and talk about it.
Now, don't run away.
Not very often do people want to
easy.
know about my little computer and geeky stuff. Okay, go ahead.
So let me just ask this question. If on your baseline you corrected the current year, well, you'd correct the prior year to 4% and the current year to 9%, and then you went back to 2%, you would be able to model that, wouldn't you?
Yes, yes. Mm-hmm.
Because obviously, if you have a 9% increase one year, a 9% increase the next year is much more difficult, and another 9% the year after that is really
hard. Yeah, and the first two would basically be compound, so you'd want to, once you got it up there, sustain something you think you can keep. So yeah, you're absolutely correct.
So the model, probably the more appropriate model would be to accept what happened to us, because that's reality, and then go back to our long-term average after that.
Yeah, it's like the building permits. I know we're seeing a big spike, and we're actually 60% over the budget, but 42% over what we got last year. But are we going to sustain that? I don't know.
Yeah.
Is that a lot of catch-up? I don't know.
No.
It's like
That's the tip of the iceberg.
Yeah, but it's good to see.
Yeah, there'll be more good news there. And I assume you'd be able to do the same modeling with regard to TOT.
You bet. Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Thank you.
Marilyn, I have a question. I think Councilmember Rundle does as well.
I don't know who's next.
Go ahead.
What's that?
Who's next?
That's down there.
Well,
Dwayne?
the reason I was going to discuss it, in 1992, 93, when the bottom fell out of everything, the county went down, everybody else took, and the city of Lompoc did also. And then it started to come back, and the income started coming in, the numbers were coming up slowly in the latter part of the 90s going into 2000. Went to a conference in Sacramento, a city-wide conference, and the interesting thing was things were really hitting it, they were coming from back east, coming out here. The economist at the meeting says, look out for 2009 through 2011, the bottom's going to fall out. And just like we did, and that's kind of what happened to us now, is that numbers really took, a little bit late, but that was, so I think the way you have it set up and looking like this, we've got a good thing going. And really the pluses for the Lompoc is what we have coming in, not knowing what that's going to happen, but it's going to bring people in. It puts us in a better mode. And we're so much better than last time because we do have housing plans within the city. In the 90s, the only housing, we didn't have one, the first housing plan was built up at the Y. So I think we're that much farther ahead than if you go back and try and put us in that latter part of 1990, early part of 2000.
Yeah. One of the reasons why the projection for property taxes is at 2% is because Prop 13 limits inflation for property tax at 2%. What we saw in the middle of 2000s was increases in property taxes of 6, 8, 9%. And what we've found out is that that was a bubble. So by projecting 2%, there's going to be, as the economy comes back and housing contracts, the supply of housing contracts and people start buying again, we'll probably see something greater than 2%. But do we want to have that in our projection for ongoing costs? What our GASB 54 policy says is we use that to replenish our reserves, because anything over 2 really could be something that's not sustainable. So we're using 2% because of that. So,
Marilyn? Sorry. Thank you, Marilyn. Although I obviously, I've been through this process now quite a few times, and I understand the ideology behind that, the conservative 2%, because we always want to under-project rather than over-project revenues, of course. But I'm wondering if in the case that you not wildly, but relatively under-project revenues, you're almost as unprepared in a way as you are if you were to over-project. Do you see what I'm saying? So I'm wondering, and not being a financial analyst myself, if there is some assumption, or there is safety in some assumption that over the next year, 2 years, maybe 3 is kind of pushing it, but at least year or 2 years, that this 4% is most likely a reality, and then the projections then go back down to 2% that third, fourth, fifth year. If that is a more reasonable projection, we can stay at 2%, but I think that maybe it's more reasonable.
and that may turn out to be, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I think you're right on point with that, because we don't want to end up making poor decisions based on too much of a gloom outlook, no more than we'd want to make poor decisions based upon too optimistic of an output. For instance, I'll lay my cards out on the table. My wish and desire is to protect the positions that are included in the current grant funding. But to do that, we're going to have to realize some of the experience we've been having with growth in some of the revenues. I'm feeling comfortable enough to make that assumption. I'm not merely trying to force fit the assumptions so I can promote us keeping those positions. But I'm feeling comfortable. I'm normally a fairly fiscally conservative person, but I'm feeling strong enough that my recommendation will probably be to you to go ahead and be that bold in our assumptions, at least for the short term. I don't know that I'd bank on that too much
I agree,
way out there in the
absolutely,
future.
right.
But at that point, what I would be wanting to do as we look out in the out years is what I'd call contingency analysis. In other words, saying, well, if we get here, we can assume this, and here's where we're going to meet our needs, and that's where we then start looking at what are the other things we might be able to do, and contingent upon the experience of better numbers, then we can pull this trigger. But we aren't going to, even if we appropriate dollars in the out years, we're not going to spend those dollars until we realize the sort of growth assumptions we're making.
Okay.
Just so people get an understanding, assuming we built 140 houses a year and they sold for $250,000, at the percentage of taxes we get, that adds maybe $60,000 to us. So you can't build your way out of it. You have to have a wide swath of improvements, and TOT and sales tax are the two where the greatest potential lies. Hence our effort to get everybody to shop in Lompoc.
And I think it's real important that even as we might make some bold decisions going forward, that we do it still based on a cash flow basis. I'm debt averse. I hope we all in general practice that. There are certain things where we do want to utilize debt as a tool, particularly when we have large scale infrastructure to build like you experience in water or sewer, but for most other things, I think if we keep as the basic principle we're going to do pay as you go rather than bonding on anticipation of homes being built and thinking, wow, we're going to anticipate developer impact fees to come in the future that'll make bond debt payments, so let's go out and build stuff, parks or whatever. I would advise against that and rather go on a pay-as-you-go, and then your contingency planning is still based on a pay-as-you-go anticipation.
And I do have one last question, Mr. Wilkie, and that I wanted to ask about this slide in particular, because this is with the assumption that year after year it's a 4% increase.
Correct.
And that still shows that there's a deficit in 2017. Am I seeing that right?
Yes.
So, right, so even with like a very positive assumption, 4% year after year, we're still going to face some challenges as soon as 2017.
Yeah, and that's primarily because of our obligation under the police hiring grant to have those 3 officers for 1 year beyond the grant term. The benefit of having a 4% increase year over year over year is it compounds. So that's why the revenue here starts going up significantly, because that compounding effect, that just doesn't start with the first year or two. It does start, but not to a effect that you can actually see. So.
But again, in a more realistic sense, we may assume that 4% for the first 2 or 3 years, but chances are 2018 we'd go back down to that 2% assumption, which wouldn't look like this.
Right. Yeah. And one last thing before I ask Melinda to come up here is that in spite of the fact that none of our revenue streams are as high as we would wish them to be, we have a very diverse portfolio of revenues. We are not tied to a 90% of our revenue basis in sales tax. We have a really good mix of property taxes, sales tax, TOT, which is really healthy. There are some agencies that are very dependent on one or the other, and they get affected worse when things go bad than having a diverse economy, and that's what we do have. We're trying to raise up each one of those, and that will just benefit the whole entire city. Having said that, we're going to switch over now to our utilities. Melinda Wall is our financial services manager in charge of utility accounting, and I'll invite her to come up here to talk about the next step.
Before you switch over, I want to make one announcement. DenMat announced this afternoon they bought another company. Another company that they will be bringing to Lompoc. No, I pulled it up 2 minutes before I walked in here, but the deal was signed today. So
before Melinda starts, I just want to say that this presentation has taken several months to put together, and the collaborative effort we've had between the 3 of us and between the whole department in finance as well as administration has been very fulfilling. I'm very happy to have the staff that's sitting behind me right now in the chairs that they're sitting in, so that having them here has been very, very beneficial to the city, I believe, and especially to the finance department. So.
Thank you, Brad. Thank you, Dean, and thank you, council members, for allowing me to speak today. As it states up there, I'm going to go over the enterprise funds. Enterprise funds are business-like funds, and the four major funds that we have are water, wastewater, electric, and solid waste. And my most emphasis will be on water and wastewater. What I have here is the water revenue and expenditure history for 2006 to 2013, because I always think you need to see where you were before you see where you're going. If you look at the chart up above, I have expenditures and in the dark blue, in the revenues in the green. The enterprise funds are business type funds, so we can't compare the fund balance. What we need to do is look at the net income, which is the revenues minus the expenditures, and we need to look at the working capital. And working capital, you should realize, are the current assets, which include things like cash and accounts receivable, minus the current liabilities, which are the accounts payable and the current year bond debt. What you see here is the fact that we've gone down, and that's why we came to you in 2013 to ask for service charge adjustments. We do have some fluctuations in revenue, but those are one-time things. But basically, when we came here and got our rates adjusted, this is the new projection from 2014 to 2021. Happy to say that the revenue projections, although we started later in the year than July 1st, that was part of the consultant's projections, that our revenues are where the consultant projected just a few months short. So the first year, you can see in 13-14 that our revenues almost match our expenditures for the year. Oops. What I show you here on the water projection slides is the fact that the purple line is the 90-day operating reserve. This is what we'd like to have and get to with the rates that we proposed if they go into effect, that we will be able to meet that in the second year in 2014-15. And in 2015-16, we'll actually be able to start putting money aside for capital items such as your repair and replacement programs. This is on target. It's where it's supposed to be. It's a good chart. But we do need those rates to go into effect the second year to keep it going. Just to point out the difference between the revenue on expenditure history, the expenditure history shows the regular operating revenues. It shows depreciation. It doesn't show the capital outlay per year. It's because as an enterprise fund, it needs to balance out. When we look at the water projections, we are the 13, 14, 14, 15 year, we kept our capital outlay items low. This does reflect capital outlay items, not depreciation, to be able to match up with what we had anticipated in our revenues. We'd be able to, in the year 15, 16, actually put into the capital outlay some of the items that we'll need to have into place for the transmission lines for the water system. There are several other things that the water department needs in capital outlay for future years. That's kind of why the working capital line kind of stops at 2015, 16, because we'll need to go through at that time and figure out exactly what we want to have in our reserve for capital improvements. The next slide shows your wastewater revenue and expenditure history over 2006-2013 year. This really shows the fact that we did need to have our rates go into place in 2013. It shows a history again of the revenues, expenditures. expenditures are calmed down because it just shows you the depreciation part of it, not the actual capital outlay. And so, we had the wastewater treatment plant being built out in the 2006 to 2013 year and was completed in 2013. Going forward,
Linda,
yes.
back one slide real quick.
Yeah.
Big jump in expenditures, 12 to 13. What was the cause of that?
This is when our depreciation started hitting in, because again, this is our history and it's based on our audits. In our depreciation on our wastewater treatment plant, you're looking at a $106 million plant divided over 30 years. So you're going to get approximately $3 million just in the plant depreciation of when it went online.
Okay, thank you.
There is a spike in revenues, or those are just one-time revenue things that had happened for reimbursements. And we have two partners, as Brad was mentioning earlier. We have the Air Force Base and we have the Village. And they did give us in 2010 monies that are held in reserve for working capital. Our wastewater projections show where we think we need to go. The purple line again is our operating reserve that we'd like to reach. Under the current program that we have, it doesn't look like we're going to be able to meet it, and that's because of two reasons. The two reasons have to do with our revenues. We get revenues from not only our customers, but our Air Force Base and the Village. We've seen declines in our Air Force Base. We do have agreements with both the Air Force Base and the Village, but they have been using less water at this time, but they're still paying their full share of capital and debt service. We are under negotiations with them to get our current agreement renewed, because it's every 35 years and it kind of expired this year. And so we are working with Tim Smith and Larry Beam and King Bradley with the Air Force Base to get that renewed. So what you see what happened here in the revenues. Although our water expenditure, our water revenues were where the consultants were, the numbers that we had set up in looking at the revenues were based on a winter averaging, and the winter averaging in 2011 was 7 units per household. The winter averaging is you take 6 years of data, you throw out the high year and the low year of the water consumption for the lowest months, which are January, February, March. And in 2011, that was 8. Now it's 7. People have been wise. They've learned how to use the water, when they're supposed to, and unfortunately, our revenues aren't. It's going to improve our revenues so that we will have a positive net income in year 3, as long as we adopt the rates that we proposed, but it won't get us to the 90-day operating reserve, which is something that we'd like to see unless we do some other changes in our system.
Melinda, what number of new connections did you guys project when you were doing these? Do you recall?
When we projected the first year of 21% increase in rates.
No, I'm talking about new connections, new services. Do you know how many units you projected?
We didn't. We did not project any.
So this is flat?
This is a flat rate.
Okay.
All of the revenues were based on, for the enterprise funds were based on no additional growth, but the rates that were adopted. So these could change. People could use more water this winter, and then those rates may be adjusted up. But we will have a positive net income in the year 15-16. And we do set aside money for capital improvements in those years.
it looks like the expenditures also increased over the years. Is that, again, due to depreciation, or is that?
The projections show actual capital and not depreciation. It shows the increases in bond debt, which is 44% of the expenditures all the way down the line. Revenues are 14%, and they reflect the increases that you heard in the general fund, are the same increases that you'll see in the wastewater fund, in all the enterprise funds.
So this projection doesn't include infrastructure improvements in it then? This is just the plan?
It does include some capital improvement, but not the full amount that was, we projected about $750,000 after these first 2 years, and from 2015 to 2021. So it's more than what we've been doing, but it's not exactly where we need to go.
How difficult is it to factor in new connections? Is this basically the same tool that he was explaining earlier?
Yes, we can factor in new connections.
Sorry, I had one thing.
Well, I guess, I mean, if you align that with the housing growth rate, it would be close to zero up until recently.
Yeah, but that's the point going forward, is the housing growth rate isn't going to be zero, it's going to be a number. I mean, functionally we know how many houses are going to be built this year because they're in the mill right now. And we know statistically what the average number of houses that have been built, or, well, I shouldn't say houses, average number of dwelling units that have been built in the city over the long haul, which is about a 1% increase. So you'd prefer to take a look at this with a projection of a 1% increase? I probably use just 0.8 because I'm a little on the conservative side, and we've had difficulty getting all the things rolling. I mean, I know how many things are going forward, and I see what time frame they're in, and I think we could probably look at 0.8, and I'd feel awfully comfortable with that. And I think we're going to be above that just because of the number of houses that weren't built over a 5-year period. We basically were 500 houses behind today if we had been at 1%. So, I'm sorry.
I just wanted to interrupt real quick. Ashley's question, Councilmember Costa's question earlier about the increases in cost, the projections for the utilities is using the same model that was used for the general fund, and all the cost pressures that are on the general fund from PERS are also in these projections. So that's it.
And it does have a CPI for operational costs too. Thank you. The next fund we want to look at is the electric fund. This again is the history of the electric fund. And what you can see here is that the total revenues have a steady growth reflecting the rates. What varies is the total expenditures, and that's your NCPA power purchase that you see going on. And it's important to note that the working capital here does vary, but it's set up with a reserve. The electric fund is the only enterprise fund that does have a reserve, and it has a reserve for not only a 2-month operational, it has a reserve for disaster, it has a reserve for some employee benefits, and it has a reserve for rate stabilization. So you have approximately $3 million of the $10 million reserve for rate stabilization. So you can see that our working capital is healthy in 2013, and our net income is starting to drop. But I wanted to point out the electric purchase power. It's important to note that what we had budgeted here in 2014 is slightly different than what we have actually projected for the year. There's about a $2 million increase in NCPA costs that are mainly a reflection of increased costs due to the drought. We don't have the hydroelectric power as much. That's a cheaper form of energy. And then we have costs related to greenhouse gas, which is credits we have to buy for the Lodi Energy Center that we have. So those prices have gone up. Just like to point out to you on this slide, on this side, this slide is the kilowatt hour cents that we're paying for services. And right now we're approximately 10 cents per kilowatt hour. We charge 14 cents, and that rate has been into effect since August of 2012, when we had reduced it by 3%, because at the time in 2011 we had seen a drop in cost, but now we're reaching a point where we're at the same rate as we were in 2009, and we may have to look at the rates in the future. So this is what I'm presenting to you today. This is a what if the expenditures keep going up as we anticipate. We are going to start losing our working capital, and our required cash reserve is going to cross over in the year 2017-18. So we need to be aware of the fact that we'll have to review the rates to see if they need to be adjusted in the 2014-15 fiscal year. The next item, I just want to briefly talk about solid waste. This is a history of our revenues and expenditures with the net income and working capital. I won't go into a lot of detail because this is coming to you next week. We're going the items that you're going to see next week on April 1st had been presented to Utility Commission and had been approved by the Commission to bring it back to the City Council on the project schedule that the consultant has given us. So you'll see more information and more details, so I didn't bring a lot of that to you here today. Just kind of like to sum it up by emphasizing that the enterprise funds should be self-supporting. There are certain goals that we had set up when we first did the rate increases for water and wastewater. And first thing that we wanted to do is make sure that they had a positive net income. The second thing we wanted to do is make sure that they met their bond covenants, and that's a very important legal obligation that we have to meet for the city. A 90-day operation reserve for all the funds should be a principal goal for the enterprise funds, because those will take care of items where we have different costs or things that we need to take into concern. Capital infrastructure is very critical for utilities. If you don't have your capital infrastructure in place, you end up paying more for fixing something when it breaks than having preventive maintenance to it. Should say I'm really glad that we were able to meet our first goal to have a net income for water for the first year. That's one of those things that we wanted to do. That would be met in year 3 for wastewater, and our bond covenants will be met because we use the water and wastewater together to meet those bond covenants. And I'm glad to answer any questions or turn it back over to Brad. Oh, excuse me, I'm sorry, I wasn't quite done. I was too excited. We are asking that the approved water rates of 15% be implemented in July 1st. The approved wastewater rates of increase of 10.5 be implemented on, again, July 1st. We'd like to review the 3%. We recommended the 3% reduction in the electric rates may be looked at again. One thing you should know is that PG&E, they are raising their rates. They're actually putting a base charge in, like a meter charge to all accounts. Their first year is supposed to be 4.6 to 7% increase for everybody. They expect to do that for the next 3 years afterwards, and then tie it to the CPI. So they're doing a lot of changes in PG&E, and it's something that we're going to have to be looking at too. And again, the solid waste utility rate will be coming back to you in, next week. Thank you.
Marilyn, I do have a question.
Surely.
My question is about that electric utility rate, that decrease of 3%, because although the purchase power costs are increasing, as you mentioned, is that really something that we foresee to be continual increase? From what I've learned, the political process has a lot of impact on these rates, only in the sense that there's still discussions in Sacramento about making certain kinds of electricity considered renewable, and if we get that designation of renewable, then there's less need to get the credits. Is that something, I mean, I know it's this sort of the political atmosphere of it, but I'm wondering if, the rates are increasing now, and it's also a drought year, and again, we're not, we don't know how long the drought's going to be, but it probably won't be 10 years, right? So with the assumption that that's a process that where we can see ending in the short term, right, that may then decrease these costs again. I just want to be sure that when you're looking at that 3%, that we are making sort of the most confident assumptions we can, not just the fact that they're increasing, and so we're going to make the assumption that they're going to continue to increase. Does that make sense?
That makes perfect sense, Councilmember Costa, and I think when we come back to you to present all that, it'll be the scenario analysis. We have experience, for instance, on the electric utility. We're experiencing an accumulation of reserves toward our reserves targets a little faster than we had hoped, which is a good thing. We still ultimately have responsibilities there, but we can look at, again, scenario analysis, what it looks like with and without that reduction to see how it plays out.
Well, and especially because we have that rate stabilization monies, I think it's important to look at it, but I would just be cognizant of that, because I don't know if the political will is here to really go back and increase that, just as sort of in the crystal ball.
Okay, flip for it. You get one of
Go
you
ahead.
guys
Please,
next.
That was first.
If I may, I'd like to respond one item for what Councilmember Costa was asking. One of the side effects of having a renewable portfolio statewide obligation is a lot of the renewable areas that are areas where renewables can happen don't have transmission. So there's a lot of talk about having transmission costs to bring that renewable power to the grid. And it's a cost that's being borne by the ISO, but the ISO allocates that out, doesn't allocate it based on who's using the power, it just allocates the transmission cost over everybody. Our transmission costs over the last 7-8 years have gone up 9.7% every year, and with the expectation that they'll go up somewhere between 10 and 15% for the foreseeable future. If it goes up 15% for the next 5 to 7 years, we'll be paying about $5.5 million, somewhere around $5 million a year just to transport our power to the city. Right now, our average has been about $10 million for a whole entire power portfolio cost. So if you add $5 million on top of that in another 5 to 10 years, half our costs will be in transmission. So that's one of those areas that is both good and bad. Transmission cost is going up to get renewables to the market, but we're going to have to pay to get that renewables to the market. And we really don't have much say-so over that, except for trying to find avenues, which the electric department is doing, about creating production within the city, either through solar rooftops or solar production level. We're talking about having a solar production plant here in town, which would not have to have any transmission costs.
Well, and that's what I was saying, is that, if the political will is there, which I know that they're still working on to get hydro reclassified as renewable, that which we already, not as much now, but we will be receiving, and that's transmission costs that's already instituted in our organization, but I don't know if that's something we even consider, because like I said, it's really based on political will.
Yeah. And ultimately, a lot of agencies are not as well situated as we are for renewables. So getting more renewables to market will still be a very big push by the California market. And whether it's right or not, we will pay our pro rata share of that, whether we're using it or not.
So just to cast a little light on the darkness, in some conversations with the Bureau of Prisons, they would be interested in doing a large solar project here in Lompoc. And I've been working with someone who would be interested in financing a large project. And through a combination of some things, we might be able to deliver solar energy here cheaper than we're actually paying for it in Northern California and avoid the transmission costs. So there's a tremendous number of variables out there, as you point out, with changes in Sacramento and opportunities locally. So there's a dark side, but there might be a bright side too. And Brad loves to look at the worst case because he doesn't want to come up short on money, and I really appreciate that. And you know me, I'm the eternal optimist. I want to find the cheaper way. So you have one more?
Real quick, I just want to make this a point. One thing this model won't show us is if we do these rate increases and we, in these few years, take $5 million just to put $2 million into water 90-day, $3 million into wastewater, we've taken $5 million out of our, what I'm going to call, money that's available to spend on goods. You have to pay your utility bill, so you're going to do something without. These rates like this have to have a direct impact on general fund money in the sense of tax revenue coming back. The ability to afford a house and qualify based upon the utilities that we levy on the people. So when we look at the general fund here and we're saying, okay, we're going to get $5 million in this period of time to put a 90-day reserve, our general fund baseline isn't taking this into account. The money is now sent off. The only money we capture basically on our enterprise funds is the money that we pay our employees. The rest of the money that people have in town we'll spend in town and we'll cycle, and that's where we generate our tax revenue. I don't know if we're accounting for that when we look at, oh, well, we need to do this, we have to have this amount. But on the other hand, we have a fat city, we have a weak economy. So I don't know, is this something that works in this model, Dean?
I'd like to actually answer that, and I think Patrick may chime in too.
We don't want this to take up the 55 minutes we saved earlier.
But one thing to keep in mind is by not having healthy reserves and utilities, and healthy is adequate, we're not trying to have a reserve level that allows us to have a AAA bond rating. What we're trying to do is allow us to weather the next storm. And both of the scenarios for working capital for water and wastewater allow us to get those 90-day reserves in the first 2 years. Once that's there, we don't need to continue putting more money into those reserves. What the choice is, and I think Patrick will talk about this, is we also need to make sure that we don't transfer the cost of replacing our system to the next generation. So if we're not putting that money aside to replace our system now, the next generation will have to pay for that. And what we're trying to do is have enough money in the utilities to be able to have a system that's maintainable right now. We may have to go out and do a study on exactly how much we need to do over the next 10 years and have a capital improvement program that would give us a much better idea of how much we have to collect for reserve and replacements. And it may not be exactly equal to what our funded depreciation is. But that's something we can't afford to do without having at least a minimum of availability working capital.
But I think that's, sorry.
Wait.
Well,
City Administrator's
I will
next.
always
He got his light
I
on
will
first. Come
always
on.
yield to the council.
Well, I'm ahead of her, so you're ahead of me.
I would just, first of all, you get no argument from me, Councilmember Starbuck, that these are interdependent and not independent financial issues. You're right that If we are building reserves to some component, we are taking money that would otherwise be discretionary and disposable income on the part of our customers and shifting it to another purpose. So the question becomes, is the purpose as beneficial or more beneficial than the other? And that's what we try to keep in mind as we go forward. Our having any reserve level in place is with the idea that overall we're keeping our costs down, not just that we're trying to increase rates so we can have a lump of money, but rather so that we can endure fluctuations and minimize what our overall long-range expenses to the customer. So that's how we're designing our reserve policies. It's not to take money out of circulating in the local economy and just have it sit in an account. It serves what we hope is a beneficial purpose overall, so that ultimately there is more money circulating in the economy. It's not to become an enriched utility, but rather a self-sustaining utility that doesn't need sudden bailouts and the like.
Okay, so just to kind of put things in perspective, on September 29th, 2009, we had the presentation to the council with regard to raising electric utility rates. So the suggested strategy for restoring financial stability to the electric utility is, time frame, by June 30th, 2010, the annual deficit will be reduced by half. By June 30th, 2011, to return to a positive cash reserve. By June 30th, 2014, to exceed 50% of the reserve policy. So then the reserve policy in 2009 was $8,919,000. Having that formula corrected to today's dollars, and at today's numbers would have been $10.5 million, which is pretty much what we have right now. So in theory, the rate structure that was adopted would have got us to 50% of that, but we are now at 100% of that. In fact, by June 30th, 2019, to approach 90% of the reserve policy. So what that says is we are more than 5 years, actually 6 years ahead of the reserve policy. So and I'm not being critical of that, because one of the things you want to do when you're making these projections is be pretty conservative, because it's a lot nicer to reduce a rate than go, oops, we were a little short, we're going to have to raise it. So when we look at some of these other ones with regard to water and wastewater, those were done similarly conservatively to electric. Maybe the results will be a little happier. Councilmember Costa.
Thank you, Mary Lynn. I think Councilmember Starbuck brought up a good point. And Mr. Wilkie, I know we discuss this when we look at each utility, but that point of diminishing return where you've raised the rates too high and now people conserve and don't use as much, right? And then you're decreasing revenues because you've reached that point of diminishing return. And I think that that's a really good way to consider it with the general fund, that there is a point of diminishing return where you're just going to see less, available money in the community, and there'll be a diminishing return on the general fund. So I don't know if there's any way to physically track that. I don't know if that's too complex a system, but is there any way for us to gather that kind of data and information to see it as a trend? I mean, I feel like we may have already seen it if it was a serious trend, but maybe because because the water rates, we are projecting these larger increases. If we pay attention to that now, we can see if there is any kind of trend.
I can't answer that right now, but we can put our heads together and see if there's a way to place that in a model and probably use industry standards about how things like that interact. So my crystal ball doesn't tell me what the answer to that is right now.
I think it'd just be interesting to take a look at.
Well, and remember that when the consultant was talking to us about both the water and wastewater increase, they had an industry average of what the decreased consumption would be based on a rate increase. So that was modeled in.
Right, but not only will it affect the utility, but I think that there's a potential that it could affect general fund tax revenues as well. And so I think we do track that if people don't use as much water, they don't use, we can track that. But I don't think what we track currently is if that impacts the revenues coming into the general fund in any way.
And that's been difficult, because the place you would see that impact is on sales tax. And two things have happened. Number one, the community has responded very favorably to the council's request to shop locally, because those increases that we saw in 2012 were exclusively driven by same-store sales. The increases we saw in 2013 were 60% driven by new store sales and 40% driven by same-store sales. So, you know, we have increases going both directions, but some of that is just purchasing in town versus purchasing out of town, because we have a better selection, number one, and because we asked everybody, hey, you know, spend your money here because it supports your city. City Administrator.
The points about the eventual impact of like conservation, whether you're talking in terms of water, or electric, or whatever, on rates and eventually, you know, to the city. I know the mayor and I have had a private conversation a couple months ago that, you know, we agreed someday we're going to debate this out in the public. But what I'd point out is that when we just, I don't know what the relationship is, and we can make some assumptions and try to model that. But when there is conservation, yes, rates may go up, but overall the cost of the utility goes down. And it's an important distinction to make, because a rate is not necessarily the bill that you pay. In other words, if you conserve by 10%, and that causes your rate to go up 5%, because we have to spread overhead costs over a smaller volume, you're still saving money. The check you're going to write for your bill will be less, even though your rate went up. Because if you're using, maybe to give because if you've reduced your volume of usage greater than what the increase in the per unit cost is, your bill goes down. Because, and how that works out, how that plays in the long run is, eventually you get to the point, sooner rather than later, that you're having to build less infrastructure overall as a result.
Right,
so
and
it does translate to being a benefit.
Right, to the city, right? You're not, well, I mean, you're not getting as much value out of your savings as you with an increased rate.
No, but to the customer eventually, even if conservation causes the rate to go up, overall revenues, that the amount that they have, that a customer has to pay, can go down even if their rate goes up.
Councilmember.
Well, I'll just toss out here. If you were using only 3 units of water, you were minimum, your rate went up on your water, but your sewer went up much more. So there was no savings. It was actually a very large increase.
What I'm saying is within a utility, if, let's say we've conserved something, let's say like 20%. And as a result, you had to increase your rates by 5% to cover a 20% reduction in usage. And if your bill is halfway distributed between volumetric use and fixed costs or flat costs, your bill is going to go down even though the rate went up, because you're using sufficient less numbers. So it's the only way the math can work.
If you're a minimum user, you're not affected in that same positive way.
Right.
Because you're paying the minimum no matter what.
Right, and if it's sort of the other way, right? I mean, if you conserve 5 to 10%, but the increase is what? I mean, what are our highest increase percentages that we're looking at right now? No matter what, you're still looking at an increase.
Yeah, but sometimes we confuse rate for what the eventual bill is. And when we have conservation, you have a reduced bill, bottom line. We have a reduced cost in the system overall, bottom line.
And now, after having saved only 32 minutes, we're back to you.
Melinda actually had a good point. Is one other, not about this last discussion, but by having adequate reserves in the utility, it allows us to do a couple of things. And one of these actually segues into my next system, the next part of the presentation. But just backing up to a story, part of my job right now is to provide Patrick with how our operations goes because it's new to him. So back in March, I went to City Administrator Miller and said, oh, we're paying our debt service for our utilities and for our former RDA. And he took a look at it and said, how come we have a bond debt from 1998? How come we didn't refinance that? The reason we didn't refinance that is we haven't had a healthy structure within our water and wastewater systems to be able to go out and borrow money less than what the rate was on the 1998. We weren't healthy enough to go out and refinance. If the systems have those 90-day reserves, we might be able to go out and look at just refinancing our debt to reduce our overall cost. By doing that, we are able to get some of the savings that we were expecting from revenues by just reducing our costs on debt service, because debt service is flat going all the way out. So we have not been able to go out and look for refinancing opportunities just because of the fiscal health of the two utilities. And that's one benefit of going forward. The other thing, which is the segue into the next section about reserves, is that the recommendation in the staff report is that we want to have you tonight adopt a reserve policy for the general fund, which has been provided to us by an outside expert. What we're asking to do on the utilities is to approve interim policies. And the reason we're doing that is important because what we want to do is look at each individual utility and tailor that reserve policy for that particular enterprise fund. The characteristics of solid waste is entirely different than the characteristics of water. So we may not want to have exactly a 90-day reserve for each one. And what we're asking you to do is to allow us to come back and over time, utilizing the expertise that Patrick has from utilities as well as our existing from the utility people we have here, to develop those reserve policies that match the needs of the utilities, whether it's a consumption utility, electric or water, something that's not related to consumption at all, which is solid waste, or something that's kind of in between, which is wastewater. Each one of them may end up having reserve policies that are entirely different than 90 days, but they would be set to allow for those utilities to be operate independently and on their own, because that's what they have to do.
Councilmember Lingle.
Thank you. Brad, you brought up a good point about the 1998 bond, and we weren't able to refinance it because of our finances. And our city being a member of NCPA, we actually affect all 15 member cities. If NCPA tries to refinance one of their bonds, the financial institution is looking at all 15 cities, which if all 15 cities are healthy, they can reduce their bonds, which then will affect the cost of our energy here too. So it sort of goes beyond just our city. It goes to the NCPA and then what we're going to be charged from them for the power. So it's a good point. I mean, because they do look at every single one of the 15 cities when they go to refinance their bonds. So.
That's exactly right. So that's all a good segue into the next section, which is effectively talking about how...
Brad, let's take a break before we go to the next section.
Okay.
5-minute break.
I'll leave it there. This last section is about financial reserve policies. And I'm not starting with what I'm suggesting the reserve policies be, because for the policies to make sense, they have to be based on some underlying principles that you have. And what I'm showing up here is that the policy would be developed based on what your principles are. And I believe that your principles would be based on what your objectives are for going forward.
We got a slide you don't have.
You're missing a slide.
Yeah, yeah. So.
Oh, yours is in a different order. Okay. Okay. Skip that slide. Go forward.
So, when we were at CSMFO, one of the sessions that I attended was about reserve policies. And the city of Morgan Hill was the presenter for that session. And several years ago, they went through the same process that we're going through. And they realized that they had to present the policies in a manner so that several different audiences could understand what it is that those policies are trying to do. You have set 6 priorities as a council. The first one is economic development. The second one is public safety, and there's a few more, and I have a slide up here about that. Your priorities should be the driving force behind how we set our policies, and specifically our financial policies. So I'm trying to tie together your priorities through principles to get to a policy. And ultimately, what I'm asking you to do is to set interim policies tonight at a very simplistic manner. 90 days of working capital for our utilities, and a reserve policy that for the general fund that was commissioned by us for a consultant to do, which he did back last May, which is based on the GFOA's standards for general fund policies. So to give you an example of the differences, the principle up here is, and I'm not saying this is the principle that we're going to have, but it's a very good principle to have, is reserves and one-time revenues should be used first to invest in capital outlay items. That can be then translated into a policy that says reserves can never be depleted below a minimum level of 15% of revenues and shall be maintained on an ongoing basis for reserves, for emergencies. That policy is the rule that the finance group has to make sure that we abide by. The principle is just the guide for how we get there. And I'm focusing in on this because the financial principles that we come up with should be guiding our financial policies, not just for reserves, but also our financial policies for how we drive the budget in the next budget session. The city of San Luis Obispo has about 20 pages of policy statements in their budget to show why the budget is set up the way it's set up. We do a lot of the same things that they do. We just don't say what those policy procedures are. And one of my recommendations is when we do the 15-17 budget is to explicitly put in there those underlying principles and policies that pertain to how we set up the budget. It'll make it much more meaningful because we do all that, we just don't say how we come up with some of the numbers that are in the budget. These are all the existing council's priorities: economic development, public safety, efficiencies, accountability, transparency, code enforcement, miscellaneous. These have been your priorities for some time, and I believe they'll probably be your priorities for some time to come. What these suggested principles are is taking those priorities that you have and allowing the administration of the city to implement policies that are fostering your 6 priorities. I cheated. I have to admit that I cheated with these. These 16 the principles are right from the city of Morgan Hill, and I don't think they are not applicable to us. I think they're very applicable to us. One thing I'd like to mention about Morgan Hill, one difference between us and them is they're on Highway 101. But if you take a look at them, their population is 39,000. Except for the prison, our population is about 39,000. Their budget for general fund is about 28 million. Our budget for the general fund is about 28 million. So there's a lot of similarities between us and them, besides the fact that they have principles for financial and budgeting processes that make a lot of sense. I'm not going to read through every single one of these because there's 16, but I just want to point out a couple of them. It says critical services should be maintained for the greatest extent possible. If your priority is public safety and economic development to support public safety, then that's probably one of the things that you want to maintain, possibly over some others. One thing that we didn't do in 2009 is it talks about across-the-board approaches for balancing budgets in bad years. Probably shouldn't be done. What you should do is align your changes to the budget with your priorities. It also talks about budget cuts should be ongoing and not simply one time only. when we entered into the furloughs in 2009, it was very expeditious because it allowed us to get some savings very quickly for that 2-year period. We never expected to have furloughs for another 2 budget cycles. And in hindsight, it was very hard to find a way to exit having furloughs implemented. It's easy to say now, but in hindsight, it might have been easier just to have just have a flat reduction and look for periods of time where we could replace that. Community-wide tax resources should be used first to support community-wide services. This goes right back to the statement of property taxes, sales taxes, COTs are the primary drivers for our core services in the general fund. That makes a lot of sense. The next one talks about special services. Special services that are designed just for a few should probably be paid for by those few from user charges. To me, those two kind of make a lot of sense. Here's another one that kind of goes back to that first slide. Reserves and one-time revenues should probably be used to invest in capital outlay items, but in addition to that, it should probably be used to invest in capital outlay items that reduce your ongoing future operating costs. So you get a couple bangs for the buck. You get one-time revenues, but then you decrease your ongoing expenses, and that, to me, makes a lot of sense as well. 16, I think, ties right in with your number one priority, which is city policies that may inhibit economic development should be reviewed on a regular basis to allow for economic development to be fostered. This makes a lot of sense. I think we've already been doing that. I think a lot of strides have been made already, but it's good to put it on paper. So that's something we don't lose track of. And there's probably one more on here that's good to talk about. Where to go? Number 8, I think, is a very good thing because we have a couple of our bargaining groups in here. One of their principles at Morgan Hill is that the employees in their recognized bargaining groups should be actively involved in developing the options and ways of implementing the goals. They may have as many good ideas about how to get to where we want to get, and we should utilize that resource. So having said that, I mentioned this at the very beginning of the session and also before this part, is that we would like to establish interim policies right now so we actually have them on paper, but they're interim for many reasons. One thing is it will provide a framework for the rest of the budget cycle. That's pretty easy. But because our city administrator is new to the city and may have many good ideas for how the policies should be crafted, I want to have the ability to be able to utilize the management team that we have to develop policies that can withstand the test of time going forward for both the 15-17 cycle and later. Another reason is we could set up policies right now that are addressing every single one of the obligations of all the utilities, but it would be better to do it on a methodical, thought-out basis so we can determine what the differences are between solid waste, wastewater, electric, and water. Last couple of slides really is, I mentioned earlier that we've commissioned a general fund policy. It's been received by the city. It's part of the package that you have in front of you. It's based on the Governmental Finance Officers Association best practice methodology for how to set reserves. And that methodology was based on a template that was used in our particular situation. And for us, the optimal level is 3 months of reserves, 90 days of reserves. We're not there right now, but by having the model that's set up, we can look at this as part of the goals that we want to attain in a reasonable amount of time. It doesn't have to happen this year. It doesn't have to happen in the next 3 to 4 years, but it's part of the goal to get the reserves in the general fund to the point where it can have flexibility, just like we're hoping to get for the enterprise funds, to weather the next storm. If we had a general fund reserve policy, this is the same slide that I presented before Dean got up here to talk. The only difference is I'm showing where the reserve policy would be if it was a policy. As you can see, by using one-time revenues, which is basically the AB 702 funds, we actually met that 25% all the way up to the end of June of 2011. We've purposely been drawing down the AB 702 funds for the purposes that they were intended for. So now, really, at the end of 2015, we have what is really a true general fund reserve, and that's what our reserve is going to be going forward. So we're going to look to try to find a way to get that number from 14%, where we expect it to be by the end of this budget cycle, and eventually get it to the point where it's meeting the obligation at 90 days. I mentioned quite a few times that my recommendation for the enterprise funds is to establish interim policies. Water and wastewater, we won't have 90 days of reserves until the second or third year of our rate implementation schedule. So we're not going to get there in one year, but this will allow us some time to bring back to you reserve policies for each of the enterprise funds that addresses their debt service, their risk aversion to cash outlays, the cash flow, and also any kind of debt obligations. It will also allow us to have that done collaboratively between utilities, administration, and finance. The goal is to have those policies in place so that the 15-17 cycle can incorporate them. What are the next steps? There have been some, during this year, there's been some approved expenditures that have not been incorporated in the budget. What we'll do over the next couple of months is to bring those back to you to incorporate them into the budget. So we have all of our obligations that we've committed to in the budget. Several departments and divisions have had changes in their operations. They've come to either finance or administration to ask for the opportunity to make some changes in their operational format because of either retirements or other things have changed. It makes sense to take a look at those and maybe implement them before the beginning of the 15-17 cycle. Some of them are going to be cost savings, so we want to take a look at them now rather than waiting for the regular process in October for 15-17. I said this in the very beginning that the model that has been developed over the last year is a tool. We want to use it as a tool to allow us to come up with the best budget for 15-17 as possible, taking into account your priorities, taking into account the economic realities of PERS, taking into account anything that we end up doing through bargaining. And it's going to be something that's a living document. It's not going to be, here's what we have and we're done with it. We're going to be using it going forward to allow us to present to you on a more frequent basis. The goal is to have quarterly updates that are presented to you in a newsletter format, rather than having something where we sit down here and go through it on a periodic basis once every 6 or 12 months. So, and again, I just want to reiterate that the model has a baseline, and that baseline has some assumptions in it that we may tweak as we go forward, so that by the time we get to the 15-17 budget preparation period, we have a set of assumptions that we all can, if not agree on, we can agree that they're the basic set. We may disagree on whether it's 2.2 or 2.4% increases on some particular line item, but what we can do with the model is that we can do what ifs. We can do what ifs for adding staffing to continue staffing that's grant funded. We can look at reducing in areas where, whatever areas you may want us to look at. We may look at increased or reduced service levels in any or all of our areas. It just provides a tool for us to be able to do what ifs. And those what ifs, while there are an infinite number of what ifs you can do, we should probably focus in on the ones that fit your priorities and fit the economic realities of where Lompoc is. And that's it. So.
Councilmember Starbuck.
Thank you, Brad. I mean, having this policy and the numerous policies that'll follow are going to be something that'll provide a great continuity for us. The one thing that I want to ask about when you're going to do a policy is, what's going to be the trigger that all of a sudden we have a policy that says we will not go below 15% of our revenue or we have an amount, $6 million. What is going to be the cause to be able to use the $6 million? What are you thinking about in the policy down the road? What's going to stop a council 8 years from now from taking the money that's being saved and just saying, this is a terrible policy, I want to build a new library or whatever?
Well, the policy is going to be a resolution, and whoever's sitting at this podium in 5 or 7 years has the right to ask to have a new policy. However, having policies is a good thing, because one of the things that Bill Statler did, which is the person that we contracted with to do our general fund policy, he has done a 15 or 20 year study of Central Coast agencies that didn't have policies, implemented policies, and then after 5 or 10 years looked at what their reserve levels were. In almost every single case, they were more healthy after that time frame than they were without policies. So I'm not too concerned with another council asking us to change the policy. We have a policy, and its basics, as long as those basics are based on the principles of that we're recommending here, it'd be hard for another council to say we don't agree with the policy of having general services being paid for by general revenues. It's really hard to say that's not how we're going to do it. But the policy for the general fund actually doesn't say we're going to have 25% reserves and it's never going to change. It has outs in it that says in these events and based on council decisions, you can go below that number. But it does that in a manner that says we're willing to go below that number, but here's the criteria for how long we're going to do it, and it has a recommended strategy for getting back to that number. So having a reserve is not just saying we're going to have X number of dollars in the bank and never touch it. It allows flexibility to the council, whichever council is up here, to weather the next economic storm. One of the things that was mentioned in the presentation at CSMFO was that by having these reserves on hand and having the reserve policies set during economic good times, and we, for better or for worse, this is an economic good time, it allows the people that are in these chairs in our situation in the bad times to be able to rely on those policies to weather that storm without saying we have to start from scratch because we used up all of our reserves, now where do we go? There are some other agencies in this northern county that have gone through $12, $14 million of reserves, and they're at the bottom of the bucket, and they're still using their reserves to maintain their level of services.
Right. I guess just in my own mind, your intent here with the policies, you're going to have one for the general fund. We're going to have a reserve policy then for each of our enterprise funds. How many policies are we going to try and have?
There are some agencies that have by fund, some agencies just have a general outline for what that fund does, what its responsibilities are, and what the reserves are for that particular fund. So we could theoretically have a policy for each of our existing funds that would normally have a fund balance. My recommendation is to limit it to our major funds, but it would allow us to extend that to some of our minor funds when and if it makes sense. And one of the minor funds I think that makes a lot of sense is to look at our reserves, say, in the campground fund. It's actually in a fairly negative situation because it has a loan that is paying back to the insurance fund. Once it gets to the point of having a positive fund balance, it can possibly start developing that extra piece of land and use that policy for it to keep track of it. The nice thing about the campground is it's not one of the 218 controlled enterprise funds. So once it generates enough money and has paid off its debts, any revenues that come in over the expenses for that can come right back in the general fund and provide support to the general fund.
Bob? Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Brad, I'm assuming it'd be safe to say that if these policies were in place, say in 2006, we probably would not have had to endure the difficulties we had 2008, 2009, 2010. Now, the city was able to provide services. I don't really think we decreased any services. So the services were provided, but what really took the hit were the city employees here. I mean, they sacrificed a lot. So if these policies were in place in 2006, do you think there would have been the same hit on our employees during this time?
That's a loaded question, but
Well, not really.
I'll try to answer it in this way. We actually have a fund balance policy that was implemented in 2011. That fund balance policy says that if you have property tax revenue increases that are exceeding a certain level, that additional amount is supposed to be used to replenish your reserves. When our property taxes started increasing 6, 7, 8, 9%, we built that into our ongoing operational costs. And when the crisis happened, we had to unwind all that. So we had a lot of restructuring that we had to do. Had we had the fund balance policy in place back then, and we didn't base our ongoing structural cost on that increasing revenue stream, then we would have had a lot lower expense number to whittle away at to start with, rather than having built up a expense that's based on what turned out to be a bubble in property tax. So that's probably one example. I have to temper that with the fact that 2006 was an unprecedented event throughout the whole world economy, and especially the United States, and very hard hit in California. So they would have helped. I don't think we would have not had the hard decisions we had to make because of the extent of the reduction that happened in 2006, 7, 8, 9. It was unprecedented. It was very close to being a depression. So it's not something that anybody here has really lived through. And I'm sure there's some people around that were in the 29 crash. It wasn't like that, but it could have been very close to that had a few more things happen during that time frame. So.
And I think the one thing to remember is that at 6 of 08, we were at 7.5 million in reserves, which would have been more than 25% at that point in time. So we really had the prescribed reserve number then, and the additional funds that had come in were being looked upon as a way to improve programs and opportunities in the community. Just, I think, by way of looking at the one reserve policy that we do have, and again from the 2009 electric report. So by resolution 4348 in 1994, our electric reserve is to have 60 days cash reserve based on budgeted expenditures, so 3.2 million in 2009. 100% reserve for employee benefit accruals, so 361,000 in 2009. 6.5% reserve of net plant and equipment value, known as the major disaster reserve, 2.1 million. and a rate stabilization reserve annually increased by the CPI, which in that year would have been $3,194,000 for a total reserve requirement in 2009 of $8,919,000, and in today's budget it would be 10.5. So I think what Brad may be saying is that while we have a pretty basic outlook here, something fairly tailored like this will be developed for each utility and for the general fund to cover the uniqueness of it.
Yeah, the one thing that's not in the electric policy, because it doesn't have a lot of debt, it has some debt, but water and wastewater have significant debt, and the debt covenants have a lot of requirements in them that require us to have separate reserves for that. So it's very likely that we'll set up a similar set of reserves for each of the utilities in the general fund and tailor each to the needs of that utility. The general fund is going to have a 90-day, if you approve it, a 90-day operating reserve. It won't need any kind of debt service reserve or rate stabilization reserve because that just doesn't apply. So that's why I'm comfortable in recommending that we adopt the reserve policy tonight or next week at what is being provided to you, and then coming back later with permanent reserves policies for water, wastewater, electric. Electric already has one, but we might modify it a bit, and then solid waste.
Yeah, because it's from 1994. The world has changed a little since then.
But it's, except for the time when the power purchase world went nuts in 2009, it's done well for us. So it's maintained that over time, and I think that proves that having a policy allows us to keep to that policy need, because I'm not sure how many councils we've gone through since then, but it's still in place.
Councilmember Costa.
Thank you, Marilyn. The suggested financial and budget principles I think are really great. I think I appreciate you doing that, or staff, and coming together with this suggestion of adopting something similar to what you've provided this evening. I really think that's fantastic. And you know, one thing in particular is I feel like we're really looking at government and the way it functions differently now, and I appreciate that we're learning from what happened. In that, you know, what you're saying is we have these more targeted growths, or we use some of this monies for infrastructure or one-time things, not necessarily always ongoing costs where we get bigger and bigger and bigger, right? And then all of a sudden it falls out from underneath of us, and then there we are slashing our way. And that's where we found ourselves just a couple of years ago. So I think that that's really exciting for me, sort of visioning the future, government in the future. And, you know, you're looking at being more efficient as well, which I really think is fantastic. My one concern, or question rather, would be that I think, and I don't know how you deal with this, but a lot of our concern on the council when we had the potential to utilize reserves, I mean, it was needed. I mean, our employees were on furlough at the time, was that we didn't know how long it was going to last. And there was there was this idea that maybe we hadn't seen the worst of it. And I know that there's still actually this double dip idea out there that this recession may get worse. But, and I don't know if there's a suggestion of how to deal with that, but part of me feels like you do have a reserve for certain points in time, such as, you know, if in the reserve policy, if we could write something in that essentially says, you know, if we've met that 25%, and something were to happen where we were discussing furloughs again, God forbid, we could utilize those funds comfortably up until we have 12.5% remaining. Does that make sense? Where we have that guiding principle, so we know where we're going to go with that and what we're comfortable with spending. Although, like I said, the hard part is not knowing technically how long recessions last.
Right, and I think that ties right back into the creation of the model that we created. Is that by incorporating the two together and knowing that a 25% reserve is something we want to strive to get at some point in time in the future, all the scenarios that we start looking at, one of the things that we want to look at as the output is where does our reserves end up at the end of the time frame. And if you have a policy that says your reserve levels should be here, and the three graphs that we showed showed, almost all of them, 2 out of 3 showed a dip in reserves, but then a gradual recovery. And I think that's perfectly fine, and our general fund reserve provides for that. I think what we didn't have before, when we didn't have a policy, is that we were willing to go into reserves to balance the budget, but we didn't have that second aspect of it, which said we're willing to go into the reserves to balance the budget right now, but here's what we plan to do to make sure we restore that.
Perfect. So I think that because otherwise you get into that situation where the money does just sit in an account. It is a nest egg, and yeah, it's this comforting thought that it's there, but if you never utilize it for what it's used for, really what good is the reserve overall? So I think that's a really effective strategy. My other question was, one of the principals talked about not doing across-the-board cuts. I don't know. Does that ring a bell? There was something.
It does.
Oh, right. Number 4, across-the-board approaches shall be avoided because they are not aligned with the council and community's priorities. Now, if I understand this correctly, this is a pretty big shift from the paradigm we had seen previously, which is where the discussion was this is a community as a whole, and all departments have to sort of give up something, right? And that was the idea. And I know these are just sort of referenced from the other communities. I don't know if this one specifically is what you would be looking for.
Well, going back to 2009, when we had the multi-million-dollar deficit, one of the suggestions was to use a 3-pronged approach. Use reserves, reorganize some of the administrative functions, and then have an across-the-board partnership with the bargaining groups to find the other third. And that was an across-the-board avenue. So because you have your economic development is your number 1 priority, that may not be something you want to do as across the board if we have another recession. You may want to keep that in place so that we can exit the recession in a much healthier state than we went into it. By having economic development as a priority, we should be able to exit a nationwide recession earlier than others. So
I'd like to echo what Mr. Wilkie just said too, because I know a lot of organizations, including probably this one, has this history of taking this across the board approach, and it's not that it's not the worst thing you can do, but I believe if we're going to operate on a system of priorities, and you've indicated that we are, you hold certain goals in mind higher than others. So if we ever in doubt of whether we can do everything we want to do, then we have you've laid out your order of how you want to give things an order of importance and priority. And that's true not only as you are budgeting up, if you will, but it should reflect how you budget down if you have to budget down. And so I don't subscribe to panaceas or one size fits all. If your stated priority is economic development, then we aren't going to probably reduce our resources that go toward economic development as much as we might in other areas that don't make your top priorities, or public safety or whatever else. And I think we can do that and do that without apology to say, you know, we're going to cut more in some areas than others if we have to cut, just like if we're going to build in some areas, we're going to build more in others. And I think that's part and parcel. Then there's the practical side that you don't take across the board approaches, including in setting your financial reserve policies. I think a good example is just looking at your utilities, and you'd say, wow, if you look at water, sewer, and electrical, for instance, and what do you need to have in place for catastrophic failure? It's going to be different than it is for, let's say, solid waste. It just is, and you don't have as much exposure in solid waste as you do in those other utilities. So taking a customized approach just seems to be a more prudent method of setting your financial reserves, and ultimately in how you build or deconstruct a budget.
So, but then I guess the one thing, I guess for clarification, then the status of the reserve, each reserve fund could then dictate how that fund what the status of that fund is in a recession. Excuse me, I can't even speak. Do you see what I'm saying? So if each have its own reserve policy, which is then going to dictate when you can utilize those funds, at what point, into how much, right, and all those things we were talking about just a minute ago, the status of electric, for example, could be in a better situation if they have a better reserve fund, a fuller reserve fund with a reserve fund policy, than if the general fund didn't have a full reserve up to that 25% that we're looking for. Does that make sense? So, and I'm saying this sort of because I know that in the past that was kind of the rub with a lot of union bargaining groups, was that wasn't the approach that was taken in the past. And so you have one utility that has a large reserve that's considered sort of in a relatively healthy situation, and another one that's not, but you still saw more of across the board. Now, I give credit to our previous city administrator because the cost savings that we needed at that time were so extreme that I feel like you probably only would have gotten it in that way at that time. But I don't necessarily think that'll be the case for, every recession that we come across.
Right.
Well, certainly there still is the reality that we're dealing. This ultimately is a human resource organization. We do what we do with and through people. We serve people. We have people who are serving people. It's ultimately a human organization. There are some dynamics that are involved that reflect those human groups, including our labor groups, and what their sense of equity and fairness is. And so that always has to temper into, as you set these policies going forward.
But each fund reserve will have its own separate policy that will then dictate how those can be utilized.
That
would be our recommendation. Yeah.
Okay, and I think that that's effective because I think, Councilmember Starbuck, if there's a council 8 years from now who wants to use all the money to build something, it's going to be a lot more challenging politically because they're going to be going against a policy that's been established and suggested by staff. So I think that this is a very useful tool in policy.
And it's worked well for many years in electric, except for that one period in time when power purchase rates went through the roof. So.
Yep, that would be next. Okay, who out there would like to talk to us about a reserve policy and guidelines? You guys are no fun at all. Going once, going twice, gone. Okay, so I think where we are now is the staff has recommended we take on this basic outlook for guidelines. I think, I don't know if the council's pleasure is to wordsmith on the recommendation on the Morgan Hill document, or if we feel that it's close enough for an interim document, remembering that what we're doing now is just something for how long, City Administrator?
I think it's going to be ongoing conversation in the next few months as we make our way toward the time periods that we're going to begin our preparation for building the next budget. So
this is an interim approach that we would take for the balance of 2014, shall we say?
Right. I would hope by the time we're building the next budget cycle that we'll have more developed and implemented, brought to you for implementation, the individual reserve issues with each major fund.
Okay. Councilmember Starbuck.
At this point, I'd like to take the city administrator's advice and have this come back at a meeting where whether it's consent or whatever, but, I've got it, I've grasped it, I'd like to see where you're going with it.
Mm-hmm. And it's a big change from what we've had in the past, so if you want to contemplate what of those 16 make a lot of sense.
I don't intend to delay it, but I would like to understand it a little better and see something other than just this small report we have on it.
Right. And I probably won't expand on that as a staff report, but I can certainly provide some additional background of where I got some of the ideas for it, because I've utilized some of the GFOA's resources to come up with some of the ideas for the policies. So
Well, I just think that we're in a special meeting workshop now, and I think that when we're going to set a policy, we should do it at a meeting, and that gives me a week to think about it too.
And we mentioned that at the very beginning of the meeting, is that because of the breadth and extent of what we're proposing, bringing it back at the 1st or the 15th would be perfectly fine. So,
Councilmember Homdahl, then Councilmember Costa.
And I'm real pleased. I agree with Dirk on this too, is that I like to have him come back with the policy kind of laid out, and also a projection of how long everything will be implemented. You can't do it in a year. There's going to be a lot of stuff, but some type of projection, just how long it's going to get all this in place.
Well, when I was talking, I'm sorry, but when I was talking about taking it as a measured approach, we are only 6 months away from when we start the budget process for 15-17. My hope is to have these either done by then or at least incorporated into that budget process. So October is not that far away.
No, I agree with what you're talking about too on it, is that you also said implement a lot of these things you're going to be doing down the road is going to take some time. It's not going to be overnight. But like the major policies, the way we've talked about tonight, and the layout of those, if we can have that at the next meeting, because it puts everything in perspective. I'm very pleased to see what we're doing here, because I see what happened. We weren't set up that way with what happened in 2006 and back when you got it in 2009 and on. We don't want that to happen again. So the projection of the layout on it, and the sooner the better, but not so fast it puts us too fast.
Yeah.
It's one of those things. But I think the overall layout on your program and what you're asking for is right down the line, and we can use Morgan Hill or use anybody you want to. We got to remember in Morgan Hill, maybe it has 101, but the fast 101 doesn't go through Morgan Hill anymore, so they don't get the total amount of revenue they did before they put the bypass in.
It was just happenstance that they were doing the presentation, and they actually have a population and a budget that's very close to us. I was very surprised. I could have been basing it on a presentation from a city that had 10 times the size of us, but I would think the principles would still be applicable. And our city clerk just mentioned that we're way past the deadline for April 1st, so if it comes back, it will come back on the 15th.
Councilmember Costa.
Thank you, Marilyn.
Maybe May 1st.
Maybe May 1st. I feel like I didn't succinctly say what I was attempting to express previously. My only concern with the 16 is number 13, because I feel like it doesn't allow us to utilize those funds in the case to eliminate the instance of furloughs or position reductions or those kinds of things that you need for those continued day-to-day operations. Now, we can make that based on priority, like you said, but I just want to make sure we're not tying our hands there.
Absolutely. I think when we come back with the more formalized policies, as important as setting the what level we think we want to target, as important as doing that is targeting the conditions under which you would be willing to dip into those and then have some time before you start rebuilding them. So I think you're absolutely on point on that.
Because I think time frame wise and amount, I don't know, I mean, reading through, 3 months is reasonable, general fund 25%, that's based on a recommendation that I saw. Who was that letter from in the very back?
Bill Statler, he used to be the finance director for San Luis Obispo.
Right. So, that obviously has some credence there. So I think that that's going to be less a concern and more of that content piece. So I'm not even sure if you can flesh that out by May 1st, to be honest, because I would love for this to really have some time to saturate.
Well, what I could do is probably, and May 6th is probably the next time it would come back, is to separate out the resolution so that the general fund can be adopted by itself, and then talk about the interim policies for the utilities separately.
With the objective of being able to adopt all of them at that time.
Okay.
Okay, any other discussion on this? Okay, seeing none, we'll move to written communications. City Clerk? Yeah, I think we have consensus.
No written communications.
Okay. So my thought, listening to all of us, and I didn't ask everybody to nod their head, is that Brad would come back with this on May, whatever it is, 6th.
Yeah.
Everybody's on that? Okay. Well, we have to turn over and do the last two things on the agenda.
I'd just like to say thank you for your 2+ hours of attention. I appreciate that. This was a lot of information. I think it was a very good discourse over this whole time frame, and I appreciate the time, and I will leave it at that. So.
Brad, you know your department always has me on the edge of my seat here, you know.
And I think this is just the outgrowth of that windshield program they got with the water and wastewater, and they've been looking through the new windshield. I would just want to talk about one thing under council requests and comments. There is a deadline that we are drawing towards to put something on the ballot for this year, and one of our council objectives on the long list would be a ballot measure to get our business license fees in order, because they were adopted, and I'm going to say it was 1992, but I wouldn't swear to it. I didn't pull it, without COLA, which basically means they're worth a little less than half what they were when it was adopted, number one. And number two, the way that was adopted, large box stores were not even envisioned, because the biggest store in Lompoc at that point was Moore's Department Store. And so if you look at the revenue of a large box store, I think I figured 7 small stores pay more in business license fee than a large box does. But because that is in effect a tax increase, that does have to go to a ballot measure, and we do have a deadline somewhere in May, I think, for that. And I really don't want to wait 2 more years to fix this, because we've already waited 2 years to fix it. And that is one of our larger fee structures, and basically that's designed to recover the cost, that the additional cost that a business has compared to serving a residence. And since I'm a business and I'm going to raise my rates, I didn't ask Joe, but I think I can, because it applies equally to everybody. Bob?
If you're looking for a second, I'll second that.
Yeah, I really am. I think we need to get going on that. Okay. Dirk, you're a business. You're going to raise your rates too.
Yeah, I'm not for that kind of stuff at all, but I got to say that I'm concerned in a sense about it in the world of, here we have economic development, but we're going to raise the rates to do business in Lompoc. I mean, is this something we may want to wait?
Let me back up. We are not going to raise the rates. We are going to adjust the 1996 rate for COLA so that it's the same rate today.
In Dirk language, that means raise the rates.
That kind of does, yes. Yeah.
I mean, I'd like to look at it, but I don't want to make a decision on it, but it may be one of those down to the wire things for sure.
Well, and I'm given to understand that we have really the very lowest business license rates, other than Buellton, who has none.
There's a carrot.
Yeah. So, yeah, I don't think that's a big carrot, because when we're given the carrot to, the biggest carrot goes to the largest stores, and it's kind of spit in the ocean for them. You know, so for instance, the increase for a small business would be about $40 a year.
I mean, obviously, I'm going to go ahead and look at it, but like I say, I'd like to look at it and then vote on it.
Oh, absolutely. No, this is just to have the staff bring something to us for a decision. We're not even agendized to make any decision now. So everybody's good with that?
I'm just concerned about the cost to put it on the ballot. Is that how costly is that?
That would be part of the staff report. Yes, there is a cost.
Is that something that we can do in a quick turnaround time, City Manager?
I believe we can do it in a quick turnaround, if I'm understanding correctly, that your desire is to merely adjust it to have a look at adjusting it based upon cost of living rates only, as opposed to us hiring a consultant and doing a fee study analysis. If all we're doing is taking those and updating, and that's the issue we're bringing forward, we can do that in a short amount of time.
Let me just clarify by saying it's a cost of living, but it's also correcting the upper bracket so that it more appropriately recognizes, how would I say it? On a percentage basis, it's parallel to the lower bracket.
Okay, again, in that case, I think we can still bring forward something in fairly short time frame and maybe just bring for that component, bring you some options, and it's your policy call.
Yep. Okay.
Okay, yeah, I would say just update us if you're, before then, if you're having any trouble sort of creating that item. I want to make sure we have all the information we would need to make that decision.
I will do so. That latter part of it is the bigger challenge than the former, but if we get there, we'll be talking.
I have some nice numbers that would help you with that. Okay, is there anything else? Any other reports? This is not a regular meeting, so you don't have to do your full report. Okay. Seeing none, we are therefore adjourned to the Lompoc City Council.
Mr. Mayor, just going to say, I'm sorry.
Almost made
Just
it.
going to say is that the empty bowls is tomorrow.
Yes.
So if anybody's really hungry for some good soup, show up to Dewey Center tomorrow.
At the Dewey Center, not at the Vest. So therefore, the Lompoc City Council will adjourn to a regular meeting at 7 p.m. on April 1st, right here